We need to see other people's views as input, but not imprint. People are gonna say stuff to us. Sometimes it's crazy stuff. Sometimes it's unfair stuff. Sometimes it's over the top stuff, super critical stuff. We're gonna get a lot of input. The question is, are we allowing that to become so internalized that it becomes imprinted on our spirit and on our soul? And so James wants us to see that when we're facing a vampire, there's something bigger happening behind the scenes than a personal one-on-one cage match with somebody. You see, that's what we make it. Like when I'm battling, it's me versus you, lock us in the cage, we're gonna go at it. And God's like, that's not gonna end well for anybody. It doesn't lead to peace, it doesn't lead to resolution. In fact, there is a far better way. It's trusting that God is working for our good, and that's what James gets at here. He says that actually vampires can be used by God to make us stronger, to help us grow, to help us develop perseverance, to become mature. And then he says this, that vampires actually can be used by God to help us get to the point where we realize something shocking, that in the end, the vampire never wins. In the end, God's people will not lack anything. We're not gonna lack anything in the midst of that. I mean, think about it. It's crazy. It's amazing to think about it, that I can find joy in the midst of dealing with difficult people, even vampires, because in the end, God is going to ensure that I'm not gonna lack anything. You see, we fight because that's the fear, that our vampire is taking something away from us that we just can't get back. But this is wrong, because the ultimate power in our challenge with someone is not the vampire. The ultimate power in our challenge, our tension, our conflict, our crisis is God himself. And this is huge, knowing that what we thought the vampire would take away from us is going to be eventually returned to us by God himself. Maybe not in the timing we thought, maybe not in the way we thought, but make no mistake, God's favor is going to be poured out on us, and that he will supply all our needs. And after it's all said and done, we're going to step back and say, God, I'm not lacking anything. What an amazing, powerful work of God in situations where sometimes we just don't see him, but we need to see him. And yes, we put principles into place. We speak to our vampires, we communicate, we speak with truth and tact. We set boundaries. We're not gonna get into a situation where we're injured and re-injured over and over again. We're not a doormat. All of that is true. But in the midst of this, we have to understand that we're not alone in it, and God is working behind the scenes to burn off those parts of us that are not us at our best, and to help us grow. This is what we teach our kids. That's our role, to model that trust and to teach it for our kids so that they can embrace that too and know that God is also with them. But there's another mindset shift that's absolutely huge here. We need to see other people's views as input, not imprint. We need to see other people's views as input, but not imprint. People are gonna say stuff to us. Sometimes it's crazy stuff. Sometimes it's unfair stuff. Sometimes it's over the top stuff, super critical stuff. We're gonna get a lot of input. The question is, are we allowing that to become so internalized that it becomes imprinted on our spirit and on our soul? This is something that we need to be very careful about, because we can get bitter. We can carry unforgiveness. We can carry resentments because of something that someone has said to us, and we can't shake it, and it impacts our own sense of self-worth. We're letting other people, a vampire, impact our own sense of identity. We're letting other people, our vampire, our critics, to help us, process and conclude that we have no value. This is something we should never do. We need to see other people's words as input, but it should not imprint our sense of identity, worth, or value. I read this story this past week of a 29-year-old young woman who said that a collapsed relationship absolutely ruined her. This relationship imploded, it blew up, destroyed her. And she writes this: about 6 years ago, I began a relationship with a man I truly believed I would marry. After 5 years together, some good, some bad, the relationship ended abruptly. My whole life changed in an instant, and I never saw it coming. In one moment, I went from being happy, so I thought, to feeling like my whole life had been taken away from me. I was devastated. And during my relationship with this man, I lost my whole sense of self. I somehow ended up living my life not for me, but for him. When he left, I felt deserted, like I've been left in this lonely place with no light, and I was completely lost. She went on to explain how she was coping with this. She said that she used sleeping pills to alleviate her pain. She didn't know how she was even going to get through the day without taking them. She no longer felt like a complete person. When a relationship breaks down, it can be absolutely brutal. And maybe you've been through that. Many of us have. You're dating somebody, you think it's one way, and then boom, it's done. It's like you're married, and then all of a sudden, it's on the rocks. These things happen in our lives. We've got problems that just surface, they blow up. They sabotage us and damage us. And so this happens where we get into a moment where something important to us that we're holding on to breaks down. We've all faced those moments. And there are exit costs in every relationship. And sometimes one person in that relationship has worked through the exit costs, like how people will think about this and how people will respond to this and what the outcome of this will be. And so sometimes one person in that relationship works through these costs and decides to end the relationship while the other person is not prepared at all and is taken completely by surprise. And that's interesting because that's what James is saying. He's saying the exact same thing. This is an illustration of that. When you fall into trials, when something happens that damages you and you just don't see it coming, this is exactly what happened to this young woman. And God wants us to know in the midst of that what surprises us doesn't surprise him. And though he's not going to short circuit someone's freedom of choice or their free will, he's not going to change how the universe is structured. We do know this: he comes to us with a promise that in the midst of that problem, in the midst of that setback, in the midst of that bomb that's blown up and just destroyed a relationship and you didn't see it coming, in the midst of that, God will never leave you. He will not forsake you. He is with us in those moments. And if we'll lean into him harder and give 100% of our faith and life to him, we will never regret giving more of our life to him when the heat is on, when difficulties mount, and when people abandon us. We will never, ever regret ramping up our commitment when times are tough. We also are reminded that our value is never linked to our critic. Your value is never linked to your critic. Your worth is never linked to people's opinions or what vampires say. Never linked to those things. Your value is rooted in the fact that you are created by God, loved by God. He has purpose for your life and he has a plan for your future. And we link our lives, we root our identity and worth and value in him. And that becomes an absolute game changer. We don't need to despair. We don't need to throw in the towel. We don't need to think our lives are over because of brokenness or pain or something that's come our way. God is working for our good behind the scenes. And this young lady began to figure that out. She had rooted her identity in a relationship, and when that relationship failed, what happens? When I put everything into this relationship, all of me is linked to this person who now has betrayed me, it leads to despair. This woman realized she had done that, stepped back, and made a big time change. She soon showed up at a good church, a church that told her the truth that she had immense value, the truth that God never leaves us or forsakes us, the truth that God has this ability to see us in our lonely moments and come along and gather people around us strategically to help us in our most dire moment, that he puts the lonely in families, that's his work. He's not tossing us aside. He's collecting people strategically to surround us, to lift us, to help us deal with that loneliness, to help us avoid that despair. And she trusted God with her life in a new way. She threw away the sleeping pills. She changed her mindset and started to realize that her life was not over. She came to this point in her life where she put that broken relationship increasingly in the rearview mirror. And she was open now to the new thing that God wanted to do that she could not see when she only harbored bitterness and resentment. That there was something new that God wanted to do, a new door that he was opening, and that her future was 100% secure. And she learned that God has this amazing ability to bring life out of the ashes. That God has this amazing ability to bring life out of the ashes, to bring us to this point where there's joy in the midst of the sorrow, and where he can turn our mourning actually into dancing. And so we're careful about imprint. We'll listen, and sometimes it's hard, but we're not going to give our vampire power to imprint our spirit and soul, because now God's part of this. And it leads to this: allow God's unfailing love to be the imprint on your heart. Let God's voice be bigger than other people's voices. Let God's plan be more important than the plan the vampire has schemed. Allow God to work in such a way so you hear what he says about your value and dismiss those who don't tell you the truth. You see, God's unfailing love should imprint our soul and shape our mind and our thoughts.